Okay, today's special guest is the king of takes on China, Jerry Gray. Anyone who follows China knows Jerry Gray, a well-balanced voice on the realities on the ground in China. Living in China's Greater Bay Area, for those of you out of the loop, you can follow Jerry on YouTube at Jerry's Take on China 799 or on X at Jerry's Take on China. Some might know that Jerry actually has traversed China from Guangdong to Xinjiang on bicycle. It's more than once. Some I would not do. I barely traverse Beijing. So welcome back to the bridge, my friend. So I wanted to talk about cycling, and we were kind of dabbling at it before the show. You have an upcoming trek. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yep. We just got back, or I just got back on the bikes about 6 weeks ago, just to try and I've lost a little bit of weight, need to lose a little more. We've been off bikes for quite a while, and we decided that we really do want another journey. So we've invested in electric bikes, power assisted or pedal assisted bikes. These are not the kind of things that the scoot around town. These are ordinary looking bikes with an electric motor attached. And we're going to go to Mongolia. So starting here in Zhongshan, basically heading in a straight line north across Inner Mongolia and into Mongolia. We're going to start that in... Go on.
How many provinces will you traverse before you get to Mongolia?
I haven't even thought about that. It's probably about 5 or 6. Certainly we'll go Guangzhou into Hunan into Hubei. And then we may have to go a little left or a little right to go around some mountains. The Qingling Mountains there are quite high, so we might try and avoid them. And we may even hit Hebei and then go into Inner Mongolia. So it's probably only 4 or 5. It's not that big a deal. Have you got the map behind you?
Yeah, I do. But I use that for like the train, not for like bicycling. I said, the one time I traversed all of Beijing, my legs were like rubber and they were literally shaking. It was difficult for me to stand at that point. For me, imagining you riding for, I don't know, how long is this trip going to take you?
About 2 months. Probably less than 3 months, certainly. Yeah, we haven't really route planned it as yet. I mean, it's not something we need to route plan, you might say, until probably a few days before we set out. We know how to get the first half of the journey done without. I mean, we've done from here to Xinjiang back again. I've done from Harbin back to here, and we've had a few extended rides towards Hunan into Guangxi, those kinds of things. So it's not something we need to worry about. But you're right about the rubbery legs. I mean, this is the thing you've got to remember. You don't get on a bike and ride 80 kilometers in a day without some kind of preparation, and that's what we do. I'm up to 50 kilometers in a day now, and that's I'm not doing it every day either. I mean, I'll skip today. I skipped yesterday, but I did 50 kilometers the day before. Tomorrow I'll probably do 40 or 30 kilometers. Just every day we'll get a ride in. And again, you don't ride without breaks. You do probably 90 minutes, then have a break, but then you're on again. So that's the hardest part, actually. After that 90-minute break, you get on the bike and the legs do hurt. And you've got to go through that burn in the thighs and those kinds of things. But it's something you don't need a lot of preparation for. In all honesty, people say, what do you need to do to prepare for that? Well, you need to have a tent because we're going to some remote areas, but we won't need that tent until we're way up in the north. We'll be near Ningxia or Shanxi with the single A before we'll need a tent because it's so developed. You need a sleeping bag and you need a couple of other things.
Before we started the show, you mentioned that some of the bikes that you use, and it sounds like you have a few, cost as much as 15,000 RMB, which is more than $2,000 US. What is the bike that I want to get, again, because this is my third bike in China I'm about to buy very soon, is about 1,000 RMB. That's like, I don't know, $150. What is the difference between 1,000 RMB bike and the 15,000 RMB bike? How does it ride differently? What are the differences?
It's usually mostly in gearing. I mean, if you really want to do something seriously, you can spend a lot more than 15,000 RMB. You can spend $15,000 if you wanted to. But it's usually in gearing. You get yourself a decent set of Shimano gears, something like the Anline or something. You get something that's pretty good in the gearing. You can ride a bike around the city and never notice the difference. But when you get into the mountains or you're cycling across the desert, so as part of the Taklamakan is a constant incline.
Mm.
Depending on which way you're going, you're either going up or down, because you're going into the Taklamakan is the second lowest place on Earth. So coming out of the Taklamakan is a constant incline. And you really need good gears. With the better gears, you don't even feel like you're going uphill. And you're carrying, don't forget, on the back, you've got a backpack and you've got panniers. You're probably carrying somewhere between 15 and 20 kilograms extra on that bike. But
Wow.
the bike trains you. You know, you get on the bike on day one and you've packed it up for the first time in a year, and you start a little wobbly. You know, it's inevitable that you're going to get on the bike and go, oh, this is different. You know, and it does train you. You know, I've always said, as long as you can do about 50 kilometers on a bike, you can go around the world. Because the first day you do 50 or 60 kilometers, the second day you might do 50 kilometers, and you would build up to the point where you say, oh, tomorrow I'll have to do 80 kilometers to get to there. Or you're riding across the desert and it's 180 kilometers to the next town, and you just open it up and off you go in your routine. You get your music going, and off you go. It's a bit of a challenge, but it's fun.
I wanted to talk about, the actual ability to see China in the way that you have, which very, very, very few people get the opportunity to do so. A lot of the times when we're talking to people outside of China online about what life is like in China, when we're in a big city or a second tier city, even, people will say, oh, well, that's not what China's like. Why don't you go see the rest of China? So since you've actually seen the rest of China, could you tell us a little bit about your experience in really small towns, villages that you've been to, or people that you've met throughout China that were different from the first tier experience?
I've met people who don't speak Chinese in China. That's interesting when their Mandarin is worse than mine, and mine's not great. So it can be interesting. When you get into the north and the northwest, you're meeting some very, very peculiar people. Sheep herders at the side of the road, and they've got a huge, great long whip, and they're looking after 50 sheep. And I've got photographs of these people. In fact, one of my friends has got a video of me meeting a Muslim a Hui Muslim in somewhere in Gansu. Don't ask me where, but it was a great video. We're having a conversation, and I turned to the camera and I said, I think he just told me that Barack Obama's father was a Muslim. And that was what he had said. We checked it later. It's really hard to tell if that's what he just said or not, but it was. You get to see the very different side of China. I can't say that I've ever had a bad experience. I mean, you get punctures and stuff like that, which you can say, that's a bad experience. But this is just part of the normalities of riding. When you arrive in a small town, I've never ever encountered hostility. Never. You get curious looks, which you could interpret as hostile. If people look at you. And then you go, ni hao. And they go, hey, your Chinese is so good. I just said ni hao, but that's enough. And, I said, can I get some noodles here? Or can I get some cold drinks? Yeah, of course you can. Come on in. Where are you? Where are you from? And they love it. I mean, it's particularly intriguing when you're in a small town at the time school kicks out. And you'll find yourself, and this happens quite often, surrounded by children who all want to ask you a question. What's your name? How old are you? Where do you come from?
Yeah.
My name is, and they're all practicing their primary school English, and it's great fun. There is a little bit of white privilege there, but my wife also experienced it. She's traveled across China several times, including a walk from Zhongshan to Beijing, which is worth talking about. So she's experienced the same thing. What are you doing? Why are you doing this? And when she explains it's for charity, and the ride to Mongolia is not a charity ride, by the way. This is just us having some fun. But normally we find people who would help us with the charity. And I've actually had people. In the first ride, I had a card made up to explain what we were doing, just in case we got into trouble, because it explains it better than I can in my broken Mandarin.
That's a good idea.
As a result of having that card made up, quite often people would come along and say, oh, here's some money for you, just as we were leaving the restaurant or something like that. Oh, here's some money for you. So I would then make the donation by WeChat back to the charity and then use that cash on the road. the actual trips are always self-funded, but things like our bike and stuff like that, they're often sponsored. So the bikes that we rode from Xinjiang back to Zhongshan were sponsored by a company here, the guy who owns the company, called Star Rapid. And he's actually a very, very good friend. I used to work for him. I spent 3 years as the training manager inside of Star Rapid. And so he's been an enormous help to us. But he paid for those 3 bikes. And then usually when we get back, we have a function to try and raise some money. And he's usually the first to donate 100,000 RMB. So yeah, he's helped us a lot. Yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Mm.
So what does the charity that you guys usually fundraise for do? What's their name?
Well, we founded it. It's just called Helping Hands. My wife and I founded it because it's not a charity. Legally in China, it's quite difficult for foreigners to be involved in charity, but we can raise funds to give to charity. And it's associated with the Zhongshan Disabled Association, which is a government department that deals with disabled people inside of Zhongshan. And for about 2 years, my wife worked for them on I would say a voluntary basis. It wasn't actually voluntary, but she got a salary of about 1,200 RMB a month. You know, when the local salary is 7,000 or 8,000, she got 1,200 a month for going to work 10 hours a day.
Well, we are on your channel, but eventually this is going to pop over to my channel and the radio. So and we've had you on the show 3 times, I want to say already. But for the people who don't. Yeah. So for the people who don't already know who you are, because we are in Tonga and all kinds of places, could you tell us briefly how it is that you came to live in China in the first place?
Yes, that was an interesting story. I came here for an 8-month contract in 2004. I was a teacher. I'd been made redundant in my old job in Australia. I was a general manager of a multinational corporation. In a touch of irony, before I was the general manager, I was an acquisitions manager. I used to buy smaller companies for my company.
Wow.
And then I used to make people redundant. And then my company got taken over. And guess what happened to me?
Uh-oh.
I was
karma.
Off. Yeah, it really was karma. So I was made redundant, and I was 45 years old. It was getting hard to get a decent job then. I was relatively unqualified, but very experienced. And I came to China just as a start of a different path of my life. I'm going to teach and travel. I'm going to travel around the world. I got a TEFL certificate, and I came to China as the first job I had outside of Australia. I mean, apart from when I was living in the UK, of course, but the first job on this route, this new journey that I was planning, was an 8-month contract to teach in China, and I'm still here. So that's how I came to China. But once I got here, I realized that I was probably a little underqualified. So I got a master's degree in cross-cultural change management, which helped me a little bit to understand the Chinese workplace psychology in particular. But that also helps you understand the cultural differences between I mean, even you and I have cultural differences, but less so than we and the Chinese, and Australians have even more different cultural differences. So those dimensions of culture became clearer to me, and it gave me a different insight into China and the Chinese people.
One of the things I find fascinating about you personally is that you also used to be a police officer. Could you tell us a little bit about your time as a police officer in the UK?
Yeah, I was a police officer from age 18 to 28. That was, I'm going to give away my age here, 1977 to 1987, and that's when I moved to Australia. I was very unhappy with some aspects. I loved my job. Don't get me wrong. I absolutely loved my job. I was very unhappy with some of the politicization of it, and I couldn't really put my finger on it until probably a few years ago, when I realized that I'm probably a socialist working in a capitalist conservative environment, and I'm not suited to. My grandfather was a coal miner, and I was on the front lines of the British miners' strike. It went for 13 months, and I worked in the southeast in London and Essex, but I traveled up north for 13 or 14 weeks of that year to basically fight the coal miners, it's like fighting your own people. I was involved in some riots in places like Brixton and Lewisham and Toxteth, which is in Liverpool. And these were things that were making me say, well, hang on, these had been forecast for years. People knew this was going to happen, and they're doing nothing about it. They're just letting the riots happen, and they would put royal commissions into this or public inquiries into that, but they didn't actually change anything. And those problems still exist today, and they still manifest themselves in the form of race riots and poverty riots. And it's not getting better; it's getting worse. And I think I saw that back in 1987. And I was married at the time to an Australian who just said, "Why don't we just go home?" And home to me was in the north of England, but home to her was Sydney. So we moved to Australia and settled there for the next 18 years. Before I came to China. So yeah, I had a great time as a police officer. I spent more than a year working in royalty protection. So I got to meet I've had whiskey with the King of England. There's not many people can say that. I've sat down and had cold drinks with Diana, Princess Diana, but she was Lady Diana Spencer when I knew her. It was before she was married, when she was engaged. I've had gin and tonic with the Queen Mother on her birthday at 8 o'clock in the morning. Stuff like that. It's strange. I've got some great stories. And once the Queen thought I was her son.
Oh, goodness.
I do look a little like Prince Andrew, but we don't talk about that so much nowadays.
The fact that each time you meet one of them, you're sitting down to drink alcohol, is its own kind of narrative too.
Well, it wasn't quite like that. I didn't just go into a bar and have a drink with Prince Charles. The story behind that was I was standing outside of a reception hall where he was due, and he was several hours late, and it was snowing, and I hadn't been. You don't get relieved. You get told, go to that spot, stand there for 2 hours, and that was it. And I went there, but I was there for about 4 or 5 hours, and he would have known that. And when he arrived, it was already late. He had a whole group of people waiting for him. He went inside, got 2 glasses of scotch, and came out and said, have this. He must have seen how cold I was. This will help you. And I now know, because I didn't know what it was then, because it was really, this is a strange thing, but I now know it was a Lafroig, which is a very peaty whiskey, which I actually do drink now, but I didn't in those days. In fact, I didn't think I might have drunk a blended whiskey from time to time, but I wasn't a whiskey drinker. But it was nice of him. He wasn't a bad guy.
Last week, I got to interview an author named Kyle. It was his first trip to China. And it's been so long since it was my first trip to China that it's difficult to know what you would be looking for, what you would be seeing. But he interrupted one of my questions to tell me about his experience of coming to Beijing looking for homeless people. He was like, I want to know if everyone online is saying is true. Is it true that there are very, very few homeless people? He had come from Portland, where there are 6,000 homeless people. So he literally arrived in Beijing, checked into his hotel, and went to the underpasses of bridges and public parks and spent his first 2 days just looking for homeless people, unable to find them. But, again, we're going back to the fact that you've traveled all over China, beyond just first-tier cities in a way that most people haven't. And so you would have a much more keen, insight into the possibility that there are homeless people outside of the first-tier cities. The government's hiding them under a tree somewhere. So I wanted to ask you, because you also did a video on homelessness recently, as someone who has just ridden their bicycle cross country for thousands of kilometers in different directions, where are they hiding them?
You do see them when you're on the road in between towns and villages. Quite often, when I say quite often, I would probably say once a day you might see one, and they're very bedraggled. These are people who have slipped through the cracks in the mental health system, I'm sure. Now, when they go to a town or a city, the police will pick them up and take them somewhere and then send them back to their hometown. They get looked after in China. So there is a system whereby no one should be homeless. Everyone has a hukou. Everyone has a registered home address. Now, sometimes that hukou doesn't exist, and the building's been torn down and they've never been rehoused. So there may be issues with that, but usually it's somebody who's fallen through the cracks in the mental health system, which is still underdeveloped. Let's be realistic about China. 70 years ago, it was the third or fourth poorest country in the world. Today, it's the second richest, but it still has the second largest population now. So, when you talk about China's social services, they are underdeveloped. So is their taxation system. A lot of things that are you take for granted. Their health system, their education system. Education is getting much better. Health is getting much better, but they are all still in the process of development. In the upcoming meeting, which I think is this week or next week, the plenary session, they're going to talk about and more upgrades to the health system. And I think social health system is just around the corner for poor Chinese people, which is great. So yeah, there's a lot of movements, and I think some of these people have fallen through the cracks, and they're not really homeless in the sense that we see in our own countries. Those people who used to have a house or an apartment, and they've lost their job, and then the bank has foreclosed on them and kicked them out. These are people who have their family don't know how to care for them. The system doesn't really help them very much. So they just go wandering. And some of them actually enjoy it. We met one guy who had a bike and he'd been traveling for 7 years. He said, I haven't been home in 7 years. Are you homeless or not? He said, I don't know. he shared our meals with us for 2 or 3 days. He kind of latched onto our group, and there was 3 of us, and he latched onto us, and everywhere we went, we got extra food just to give to him. He didn't have to pay for anything for 2 or 3 days. And then, one day he just wasn't there. Where did he go? Okay, he's gone. He's gone off on a tangent somewhere else, and hopefully found somebody else to pay for his meals. But yeah, he used to drink pineapple beer with me. One of my favorite things when you get off the bike after an 80-kilometer ride is a pineapple. It's alcohol-free beer. It's just a pineapple drink. You'll find it in the bars anywhere and the shops in Beijing. They're all over China, but it's really, really delicious when you're hot, thirsty, and you want something sweet and sugary right now. Pineapple beer. So me and him the first thing we'd do is arrive at a place and grab a couple of pineapple beers. So yeah, you do get them.
Yeah, your experience resembles my own, because in Beijing, where I live here in Shijingshan, there is one guy who I can't tell if he's homeless because I don't actually talk to this gentleman, but he's clearly not into hygiene, and he plays the erhu by the street with a tin can. It looks like an old American style coffee can, one of those big coffee cans that Folgers is in or whatever. And people drop money in there. I'm not sure, maybe he has somewhere to stay or not, but he's the only person that I see in this neighborhood. And when I was living in Wuhan a few years ago, there was a lady who had a tent set up by the river, and she was like the homeless population in an area of 3 million people. So I would go by and give her like 100 RMB every now and then, carefully, because she had
careful of that. Yeah.
She had 2 big dogs, so I was always careful about that, because I was I've been bitten by a dog in South Korea. So I usually people say, "Oh, our dog is friendly." I still don't try to pet it because
fair enough.
The fear is there. But
actually, a friend of mine did that once. Gave somebody 100 RMB outside of a restaurant. A beggar. We don't see beggars now, but back then, this is 2005, 2006, we're walking into a restaurant, an American friend of mine, huge salary, massive per diem allowance. He could not spend. I went to his house once and he opened a cupboard. It was pink. It was just full of 100 RMB notes. I mean, there must have been 200,000 or 300,000 RMB in there.
Sounds like he needs a safe.
Yeah, well, he would need a big safe for this. But yeah, what happened with him was that he used to get a per diem allowance, and it was more than my salary. He had a 2,000 RMB a day allowance, a 30,000 RMB a month, at a time when you couldn't spend 500 in a day. I mean, if he went to a Western bar and bought a bottle of whiskey and a pizza or something, he would still not spend 500 RMB. And he was getting 2,000 a day per diem in cash every Monday morning. It was huge money. And I remember he gave a lady outside of a restaurant 100, and we walked into the restaurant. When we came out, there was a mob. I would say there was 1,000 people waiting there, and they all had their hands out. Yeah,
Oh
Every
my.
beggar in, where do they come from? I don't know, because you don't see that many. Even then, you saw beggars, but not many. But yeah, he gave this lady 100 RMB, and she must have got the word out. Guess what? There's a guy in this restaurant. So when we came out of
Passing
the
out
restaurant,
cash.
yeah, when we came out of the restaurant, we got mobbed, absolutely mobbed. It
Wow.
was actually quite scary.
Wow. Noted.
Yeah.
Well, this lady literally is just like in the middle of nowhere. I mean, unless she's got like a CB and she pulls out like, he's here. So I don't think it was going to come to that. Okay. I wanted to talk
Yeah.
about overcapacity, which is something you've also talked about. Now, I like to
Yeah.
ask all my guests about this. So China is producing more solar than it's installing. And so a lot of this is now ending up in, the developing world. Is this
Mhm.
overcapacity? In your
No.
opinion, why? Why not?
Well, because first of all, there are climate issues, and whether or not we believe climate change, whether we subscribe to that, it doesn't really matter. The fact is, the world is trying to produce cleaner energy, and the cleaner energy consists of what we call sustainable or alternative energy, and then nuclear power. And China also is still building coal power, but it's cleaner coal and carbon capture and all kinds of things. I mean, the evidence is there that China has cleaned up the country very, very much, certainly in the last 10 or 12 years. It was not a clean country when I came here, and probably not when you arrived either. But it is now, much better now. So it's still got way to go. And how to do that is to produce more alternative sourced energy. And that could be wind or solar. Generally speaking, it's wind, solar, or waves. They've got hydroelectricity, but there's a limited number of rivers in China. There's a lot of rivers, but there's a limited number that you can dam, and they've pretty much done that. So they're looking for that alternative source. Now, once they've got China's alternative energy in power production is at 50% now from alternative sources. So that's a good thing. But when it's 100%, if it can ever be 100%, that'll be a great thing. So the rest of Africa, and Australia is a fantastic example. Australia is a country that is struggling with its per capita emissions. They are too high. The opposition party has just announced that they're moving out of the targets that they have, their emission targets for 2030. This is the opposition, not the current government. They need to review this. And the best way to review it is to introduce introduce nuclear power. And Australia doesn't want nuclear power. But they've got massive amounts of desert, copious amounts of sunshine, and they won't buy Chinese solar panels. And I would say that's part of the problem of overcapacity. If you've got countries that need it, want it, can use it, and are perfectly suited for it, and much of Africa is, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. So you've got lots and lots of sunshine, lots of dry areas, lots of arid areas. And one of the great things about solar panels is once you put a field of solar panels in there, what's underneath changes. Because if you've got a desert there, I've talked about this yesterday on another live stream. But if you've got a desert there, the desert gets humidity at night. Usually gets dew. And that dew is burnt off during the day, but the next day it's in the shade of these things. And I've actually seen a place where there's a fish farm under a solar farm. So normally you wouldn't put a fish farm there because it would be too hot, but because you've got solar panels there, you can put the fish farm in there, and that's dual use of the land. And that's what China is doing. They can do that all over Africa, a lot of Central and South America, certainly Eurasia. Kazakhstan is almost all desert. Afghanistan has a lot of dry, arid areas. All of the stands, the Eurasian Economic Union, are very, very much aligned with China on doing this. So overcapacity, absolutely not. And in terms of they call them subsidies, it's just very, very efficient. Yeah, there've been subsidies, there've been investments into batteries, into lithium ion, and all of those things. But those investments are normal for government to invest in emerging industries. This is very common. And Janet Yellen was Janet Yellen was yelling about this. We've invested billions in clean energy. We can't have their state subsidies coming in and undermining them. Hang on, do you know what you just said?
It was two
What did you
sentences
just say?
back to back. Yeah.
Yeah, we've invested billions. Their state subsidies. Okay. What they call an investment. Everything that America seems to say about China, you can turn it around. What they call defense is actually offense, and it's the opposite of China. When they say China is being aggressive, it's China being defensive. So it's the same with solar panels. It's the same with cars. It's everything. Everything America says needs to be taken with a very small grain of salt. Not even a pinch, just a grain of salt.
Well, I guess the next question is you touched on it, EVs. The United States has put 104% tariffs on Chinese EVs. It's not like they were buying them anyway. They weren't. The United States only had bus fleets that were coming from China. But European Union, I think it's 25%. What about Australia? What about the rest of the world? Is China dumping EVs all over the world? What's going on?
No, you can get Chinese cars in Australia. Quite a lot of them. A friend of mine's just bought, I think it was a Seal, the BYD Seal in Australia. And the problem in Australia is they haven't yet got the infrastructure for it, and they do have very long distances. This is the issue. So I think there have been two issues. Fernando and I talked about this a while ago. Fernando drives a Neo. So anyone who for Mubi on YouTube drives a Neo. It's an SUV, and he's pulling a very large caravan around China behind it, and has been doing for the last couple of years. So the issue in Australia was it won't tow your boat, mate. So if it's not going to tow your boat, you don't want this thing. Well, it will tow your boat, and unless you own the Titanic or something. If you've got a lot of Australians have these small fishing boats, and these cars will tow your boat. They will do long distances now, but currently there's a real problem in that the distance from Brisbane to Sydney. And there are towns in between, of course, but the distance is 1,000 kilometers, and trying to travel. Well, you can't travel that distance in a car without filling up. Now you can travel that distance in an SUV, in an EV. But what happens with that is that you will need to stop, and unless you're in a battery changing situation, which takes 1 or 2 or 3 minutes, then you're in a situation where it's going to take you quite a long time to recharge. So literally, you've got to stop for several hours to recharge it. And most people who buy them get rechargers at home, because the infrastructure is not like in China. You can everywhere in China you go, you see, there's an electric parking spot. You don't even notice
everywhere
them anymore. I remember
one
seeing
block
them
after the next
started.
After the next. It's crazy.
Yeah, every car park, if there's a place with a car park, some of the spaces are EVs. Yeah.
I wanted to make a video of all of them, but one of the times I started filming, a security guard there told me not to film. So I was like, oh, maybe I'm not allowed to film the EV charging stations. I don't know.
No, I think it's probably the location that you were at. You might have been outside of the Ministry of State Security. EV charging. I don't know.
Yeah,
I can't see that being a problem. Just filming an EV station. I mean, Fernando and I did a live stream from one. He got in his car. I was here sitting in my office, or my room here. It's a bedroom, spare bedroom actually. But I was here sitting here, and he just got in his car and drove down to the battery swap station with his camera while still maintaining a live stream. So that was it was really interesting. He was like 3 minutes and done.
Well, I kind of want to ask you about the economy and the Greater Bay Area. So you live in what is known as the Greater Bay Area, which is one of China's gigantic, financial integration projects. What is it? What comprises? What are the pieces of that puzzle? And what is it doing? What is its purpose? And who does it benefit?
It benefits everyone. That's the easy question to answer. In the world, actually, it benefits everybody. It's a global benefit to the world. It is it's I don't know the right word to describe it. Go back 5 years when this was first announced. The GBA is now 5 years old, so this is a very topical question this month. celebrating 5 years of the GBA. Before the GBA, we had the PRD. Everybody thought, what's the PRD? The Pearl River Delta. And
Right,
what that
yeah.
was, on one side, you've got Hong Kong. On the other side, you've got Macau. And then you have the Pearl River going up to Guangzhou. Now, basically, if you think about all of the cities up there, that's the GBA. It
So
has a
all these, this is a
population.
triangle of cities.
Effectively, yeah. On one side, you've got Hong Kong going into Shenzhen, going into Dongguan, going into Guangzhou. On the other side, where I live, you've got Macau going into Zhongshan, my hometown, going into Foshan, going into Guangzhou. So these make up the fundaments of the GBA. But they've added a couple of cities outside of that Pearl River Delta, and that's why they changed the names of it. So we've now got Qingyuan, which is to slightly to the north of Guangzhou. We've got, I think Zhaoqing is included as well, but not Yunfu, which is part of Zhaoqing. And we've got all these cities. They have a total population of about 110 million people. And
Wow.
if it was a nation on its own, it would qualify for the G7. It's one of the top 7 economies in the world. It's also Guangdong is the top economy of China, and the GBA is the when you take the GBA, it is the number 1 economy of China because it includes Macau and Hong Kong as well. So yeah, it's a pretty large area. Now, what happens? Go on.
I was going to ask you, besides, putting a circle around them, like what infrastructure or tools have been enabled to bring them together in some way that's meaningful?
Yes, infrastructure and interconnectivity. Just this week, I think, maybe this week or next week, the new bridge, and it's called the Shenzhen-Zhongshan Link, will open. It's a bridge and tunnel and artificial island configuration going from here to Shenzhen, which will make a 2.5-hour journey into about 30 minutes. So that's one of the things. But the integration that's more important than that is Hong Kong has an area inside of Shenzhen that shares technology, shares administration, shares financial regulations, legal regulations, health regulations. So this area, Shanghai, inside of Shenzhen, is effectively part of Hong Kong, but it's not. It's on the mainland. And in Macau, they have the same thing. Or in Zhuhai, the city that borders Macau, there's an area called Hengqin, and that has all of Macau's laws as well as mainland laws. So effectively, if you're running a business in the mainland and you want international access, one of these 2 places are the places to go. And there's another one inside of Guangzhou called Nansha. And Nansha is amazing. Occasionally I get asked by state media to go and have a look at something, and it's usually related to democracy or industry. I don't get the jaunts like some, because I'm not the kind of vlogger who makes pictures of beautiful scenery. I'm the kind of vlogger who talks about how China is developing. And so they say, well, come and have a look at this. And I went to the Nansha port. It's an 100% automated port. There's like 8 people working there. Wow. And this thing is unloading thousands of containers a day. It takes literally, you can count in minutes. It's more than an hour, but it's very, very fast to unload a container ship. And there's trucks moving in and out, and there's no drivers. It's all done automatically. And I'm not sure, when I was there, it was during COVID, they had employed a couple of hundred people to do a specific job, and they had an area set aside where they opened every single container and sprayed it. And then some things were important. They opened the container, unloaded it, sprayed everything in it, and then reloaded a new container. And that was how they were getting stuff into China without risk of COVID coming from overseas. That was particularly for frozen foods, or frozen goods.
I remember that, yeah. It was on the news.
I watched this and wow, this is amazing. I mean, who would think about doing that, and who would bother to do that?
Mm.
In the West, they would have just said, "Well, COVID's going to come in; it's going to come in." China said, "No, COVID came in. They did have a recognized case where COVID came from Venezuela on a packet of frozen prawns. They traced it back." And this is why they're stopping that. They didn't want COVID coming in while it was still technically a killer disease.
Well, I guess the next question is, because we're talking about GBA, the Greater Bay
Mm.
Area, what companies are down there, that are localized there?
Oh, all of them. All of
Oh,
them. Um, well, Huawei is probably the biggest. Huawei is a really interesting company. They're down here in Shenzhen and Dongguan. They have their own city kind of thing. Their office is not
is it
an
like one of
office.
those? Is it like one of those
Disneyland.
Apple type? Yeah, exactly. I was going to
Yeah.
ask you, is it like one of these amazing where they have their own bicycles and their own restaurants and canteens and stuff?
It's got a castle.
Castle.
Yeah, it's got a castle. It really is amazing. I've never been in it. I've just seen it. BYD are in Shenzhen. DJI are in Shenzhen.
I love DJI.
Insta360. Me too. I'm going out today or tomorrow to buy the Pocket 3. I've had the Pocket 2. Now I'm getting the Pocket 3. And my wife said yes. Because
yeah, my wife bought it already.
Really, I'm going to Tibet next month, so she said I can have my new camera.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Yeah,
who else is here? I mean, just BYD's factories are enormous. I've been to their headquarters, and
I've seen aerial footage of it. It was insane.
Yeah.
It's like just one facility after another, after another, after another. It was crazy.
Well, the headquarters are probably they've got roads. There's a train station in there as well. This is something you have to see to believe. The train line comes. It's inside of the ground, or the grounds have enveloped the train station. I think that's what it is. Wow. BYD owns so much. And I was also occasionally, very rarely nowadays, I get a contract to do some teaching. Now, I'm not legally allowed to be employed in China, but there's a Canadian company that asks me to go and do some stuff. And I went to this school in Shenzhen, and right across the road from the school is one of the world's biggest plants. It's a BYD plant, and the school's on one side, and that's a huge campus, and the BYD plant. And I thought, I wish I had my drone here, put it up and have a look at this and see what it really looks like. But it was massive, and that's in a kind of area of Shenzhen that nobody even knows exists outside of Shenzhen. It's a very new, Shenzhen's a new city, but it's a new area of the new city. And they're still developing that area, which is why they put these big international schools there. They say, you want an international school? Put it here. It will attract people to this area. That's what they do.
Yeah, I know quite a few Americans who used to live in China, and they mentioned they were coming back to live in China. I was like, oh, that's great. Are you going to come to Beijing, teach at Tsinghua? And they were like, I'm going to, the Greater Bay Area. And I was like,
yeah.
This seems to be the new trend. Everyone is migrating there. It looks like it's going to be the hub of, it's going to be like a, greater New York area style hub of, economic powerhouse. And which brings me to the next question. There is an online discussion between lots and lots of people, and it includes a lot of Western media corporations, which say China's economy is not doing great. And then you have a lot of other people, economists on the other side, saying, what are you talking about? China's economy is doing wonderfully. So what's your take?
If it's not doing great, why all the sanctions? Let it collapse. It'll collapse on its own if that's the case. It's as simple as that. I mean, I've looked at it from many different perspectives, and what I see is this: most people who predict that China's economy is struggling or in trouble really do not understand the Chinese psychology, the Chinese culture. China is a country that very much is a communist country still. It is a Marxist-Leninist country. There is no question about that. But then they say, but we have Chinese characteristics, and those Chinese characteristics allow a degree of capitalism with government control. Now, what happens is that the Chinese government is very, very strictly controlling capitalism and allowing capitalism to take over. It's now more than 50% of the Chinese economy is in private hands, not state hands. So that's a good thing. So it's getting bigger, but it's all under state control. So the state makes very strong laws to keep them as they are. Now, what happens with China is it has challenges. It like every other country in the world, it faces challenges, and it faced a huge challenge with the housing. They call it the housing crisis or the housing crash. I call it a controlled demolition. They forecast in 2019, this is what we're going to do. All of you developers need to comply with these laws, and you have 18 months to do it. 2 of them didn't, and the rest did. Some of them collapsed on their own. Some of them just closed down. Some of them merged with others. But the 2 big ones who said, well, we're too big to collapse, they're not going to allow us to collapse, the government said, we have no choice but to allow them to collapse. And that's what they did. They did that quite deliberately, and it did cause a bigger crisis than was anticipated. There is no question about that. But it certainly hasn't affected 99% of ordinary Chinese people. The rich investors, the foreign investors, the speculators, yeah, they've got some problems with this. I've personally got a couple of issues with it because we own 3 apartments, my wife and I. One of them is the one we're living in. One is the one we bought for cash when we first got married. And then the second one is the one we bought when my mother passed away and I had some money to spare. So I bought, and we lived in that one for several years. So we don't have to pay capital gains tax on it. We don't have to pay rates on it. We don't have to pay standing charges for our gas, electric, or water. We only pay usage of those things. So they're effectively free apartments that we're not going to sell yet. We have no mortgage. We have no debt to the bank. We have nothing. So these 2 apartments will just sit and wait now, because the price I paid for the first one back in about 2008, 2009 is about the same as it's worth now. And I've had it for 15, 16 years. So the price I paid for the second one is less than it was when I bought it. And that was, well, less than I paid for it. But that was my fault because I renovated it and I made it my home for my lifestyle, or my wife and I's lifestyle. There's only 1 toilet in there, for example, and it's in the bedroom. So you have to go through the bedroom to get to the toilet. So when we have guests, there's a little bit of an issue with that. So it's not really a suitable house for normal people to live in. But I did that deliberately because it was going to be my house for life. And something happened, and we ended up buying another one. So, you know, it didn't cause the crisis that everybody thought it was going to cause. Certainly not for 90% of more than 90, probably 95 or plus % of Chinese people are actually better off now because the mortgage rate is still low. The house prices are low. There's incentives to get people back into the market. The government has put billions into, and billions of dollars, not RMB, but into the, back into the market so that the provincial governments can borrow against that and finish off things that were unfinished. It'll pick up now. We're on the pickup now, and I think that's probably going to be the sign for everything. You know, the other challenges, the youth unemployment, it spikes this time every year. It spiked last year, and everybody said, "Oh, youth employment is up to 20%." Yeah, because it's graduation season. It's June. Everybody's just finished school. You know, that's what happens in June, and it happens every June, and then it goes down to 12 or 15%. But what they didn't calculate into that was the youth unemployment at that time wasn't about unemployed youth. It counted 16 to 18-year-olds who are not allowed to work. You're not allowed to join the workplace in China until you're 18. So these kids who have left school and haven't started university, and they can't legally work in China, so they get counted as unemployed. So now they've rejigged the numbers, and everyone in the West says, "Oh, they've only reduced their numbers because they've rejigged it." Well, if someone's not allowed to work, you can't really count them as unemployed. So the Western way, or the Western system of counting unemployed, is different to the Chinese system of counting, or was different to the Chinese system of unemployment. So
I would like to
that's
add
the
to
reason
that.
why. Yeah.
I'd like to add to that. You know, people like to point at youth unemployment because people are entering into the workforce. It might be different from other cultures, other economies, other nations. But if you look at just unemployment, China's at 5%. And, you know, last quarter it was at 5.1%. And the quarter before that it was at 5%, which is very nominal. That's basically where you want unemployment to be. So that the West is choosing this one metric to pick on China doesn't really make sense. But I did want to ask a follow-up question about the economy. Because I also get people online saying, "Oh yeah, sure, you've shown me some data that shows that China's economy is doing well, but for who? It's only benefiting the rich millionaires and billionaires, and everyone else is suffering." Is that the case, Jerry? What is your take?
I think it'd be the opposite to that. I don't think billionaires and millionaires are suffering financially anyway. They're not suffering from the economy. Chinese system, I mentioned earlier on, the Chinese taxation system is very underdeveloped. The richer you are, the more tax you pay. Oh my God, there's a thought. This is something that used to happen back in the 1960s in the UK, and this is why all the pop stars and movie stars moved to America, because they were getting 97% tax. But if you're earning $1 million and you're getting 97% tax, then you've still got 30,000 or 300,000, whatever the number is. I'm not good at maths, but you've still got a fairly decent income when you're earning that much. But this was only on people who were earning in the millions, the Beatles and people like that. We're going back 40, 50 years when this happened. Now they've reduced that and changed it. So the more money you earn, it seems the less tax you pay. And China isn't like that. So yeah, rich people do pay normal taxes. There are very few things that you can use for tax deductions. Corporations can, but individuals can't. When you get this much salary, you pay this much tax. So some people get a little smarter and say, well, I'm not going to pay myself. I own the company. I'm not going to pay myself money. And they're the people who are kind of getting away with some things. But everything they buy has a sales tax on it. So they're buying more things. They're buying more expensive properties and paying a property tax on it. They're buying more expensive cars and paying a luxury tax on it. They're buying a Rolex watch and they're paying 150% tax on it. So things like that. The luxuries are getting well taxed because the normal people don't buy them. If you can afford it, well, you should pay the tax on it. Simple as that. So, I mean, nobody likes paying tax, but you've got to accept that it's a fact of life. Tax and deaths, I think. Tax and death, as the expression goes. But the challenge is not for the poorer people. The ordinary people in China, on a year-by-year basis, are better off. If you take a look at the pretty much any city, rural populations too, anywhere you go, you'll find that the average income is ahead of the inflation rate. It's rising ahead of the inflation rate everywhere in China. So if you ask 100 Chinese people if they're happy with their life, they'll all have their gripes. But are you better off today than you were 10 years ago? Oh yeah. Do you think your children will be better off? I think so. Yeah, I hope so. Pretty much everybody in China is confident that the future is good, because they're very proud and nationalistic, and they can see what their country is achieving. And there's no question about it. China has achieved so much mostly in the last 10 or 12 years, and you can accredit that to Xi Jinping. But all the work was done before Xi Jinping took over. He did have an easier ride, because even Hu Jintao was doing great things. He did it quietly, and Jiang Zemin was doing great things. And we've had a series of leaders who have built a fantastic foundation for this country to get where it is today. And where it is today is better than where it was last year, and where it is last year is better than where it was the year before, and so on. When I arrived in Zhongshan, my salary was 15,000 RMB a month, and the average salary here was 870. I was as rich as Croesus. 870 RMB a month. This is 2004. Now, I mean, I probably be lucky if I can raise 15,000 in a month now, but everybody else is earning more than me. That's a fact.
Well, okay, I want to change the planned questions a bit. Just a few days ago, Australia and China announced that Australians can travel to China visa-free, including New Zealanders, which happened a week prior to that. What do you foresee this? Is this going to benefit Sino-Australian relations?
It'll benefit mine because my family can come, but I think it'll have to. People who come to China see China as it really is. I've done a lot of work on Australia recently because of that. I've written a couple of articles that have been published about the Premier League visit, and done a lot of research into what's going on. Australia, as a general country, fears China. The people of Australia fear the people of China. They think that China is ready to invade Taiwan and then roll over and invade Australia. Now, of course, you and I know that's absolutely ridiculous. And if I mentioned that to my wife one day and she just snorted, why would we invade Australia? What are we talking about? I mean, the fact is China doesn't have the resources, it doesn't have the facilities, it doesn't have the manpower. It's not going to invade Australia. It has no intention of doing that. But American media, American influenced media, American influenced intelligence, American advisors to the defense system, American advisors to the politicians have convinced Australians that China is their enemy. China is their threat. This is a country, America is a country that has insidiously taken over Australia. It owns Australia. It owns all the big four banks. It owns the big industrial complexes. It owns the agricultural industry. It owns the retail industry. It owns the transportation industry. It doesn't own the communications industry, but it does have a huge, huge influence in the media. American influence in Australia is massive, and America has a massive misinformation campaign on China. So people in Australia, every survey that's done, people in Australia believe that China is a threat to Australia. Huge numbers of people, like 70, 80%, think that China is a threat. I mean, if you ask them if they're a challenge, it'll be almost 100%. But a threat, a real threat to Australia, they think it is, and it's not. This is my point. I usually finish off my articles with words like, China is not a threat to Australia. The people telling you China is a threat to Australia are the people you need to worry about. So that's, well, I guess, in that sense. Go on. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No, I mean,
well, I was going to say in that. Sorry, in that sense, China inviting Australians across for 15 days is great, but it's not going to allow them to see the country. The other aspect, because that's a unilateral 15-day free, that doesn't go the other way. There is a bilateral aspect to the visas as well. I'm not sure if New Zealand got the same. I expect they did. But the bilateral aspect is that if you apply for a visa, you want to come for a longer period of time, you get a 5-year multiple entry visa. So that means you can come for a month or 2 months every year for the next 5 years on one visa. So you could come for, you could live here with that visa for 5 years. All you need to do, if you're in the Greater Bay Area, go across to Macau for the day, have a burger, come back, and you're back into your next visa cycle. So if you've got a 60-day or a 30-day visit, we used to live like that in the old days, long before the proper visas. I'm going back to 2004 up to 2008. That's what a lot of people did, including me. We came over here on a business visa. We worked. It was technically illegal, but nobody cared. And every 30, 60 or 90 days, we'd have to cross the border. We'd just cross the border, turn around and come back. Literally didn't even stay the night. We'd cross the border and not even leave the building, turn around and come back. And we used to call it a turnaround. And that's how we got our visas. So the visa.
Yeah, I remember back in the day, so many people used to do the Hong Kong run or the Korea run and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Well, I personally think that, because when I went to the Philippines, when I went to Thailand, and also my experience here in Beijing has been meeting a lot of people from New Zealand and Australia. So it seems like they like to travel internationally, live internationally. So the opportunity to come to China and spend more time, in my view, it seems like when they return home and they're like, actually, China was really lovely. It's like, it's got its problems, but it's, also very lovely, in its own right. And it's very modern. I feel like that is going to dissipate, maybe it's American media or Australian media, whatever, those narratives that China is out to get Australia, because the reality is it's not.
I'd like to think it will. I'm not 100% convinced that it will. Many people, I'm online all the time talking about things like Xinjiang, and many people say to me, yeah, but you can't possibly have seen it all. I get that. That's a fair comment. I can't have seen it all, but I cycled 5,000 kilometers across that one region. It's a very big region, and I've cycled only 5,000 kilometers of it, but I've been there 4 times, and each time I've been there, I've experienced the same thing. You get welcomed by the people. You get helped by the people. People who are oppressed don't help you. They don't welcome you. They close the doors against you. If you're a stranger, this is a fact of life. People who are oppressed will be hiding from strangers. And I've never experienced that anywhere in China, let alone in Xinjiang. And so, it's going to be interesting. I'm off to Tibet again, so not again, it's my first trip. So I'm going to find out what the oppression is like in Tibet. I guess it's about the same as the oppression in Xinjiang, which is nothing. It doesn't exist. There's a high level of security.
That was my experience. That's all the time I have, Jerry. It was really lovely to talk to you. I hope that we can do this again.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us.